Well, let's get started, everybody. One of your final panelists of the day is now upon us, and we've got a great panel here. I'm really impressed with the group that the Chamber assembled for our conversation about some of the developments that have happened since the war started in Ukraine and some of the things going forward as well. Just a point, I was with President Biden on his recent trip to Warsaw, Poland, and it's just remarkable to see the support that Ukraine has around the world, particularly when I was in Warsaw. And also just 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Ukraine's ambassador to the US, and it was an interesting interview. It was at opening day of the Washington Nationals, and I have to tell you, if you did not see it, she threw a perfect first pitch, so pretty impressive. Well, let's get started. Let me tell you who we have here on our panel from the far side here. Oleg Bornikov, Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Digital Transformation. We have Max Peterson, Vice President, Worldwide Public Sector of AWS. Rita Jo Lewis, President and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Export-Import Bank. We have Ilya Borman, Google's Head of International Government Affairs. And we have Matt Devlin, Uber's Head of International Affairs. Let me start off with you, Alex. Digital connectivity and access critical to economic and social progress in Ukraine. And prior to the war, Ukraine was one of the main global exporters of IT services. Why has technological innovation been so successful in Ukraine, even during the war that Russia started more than a year ago?
Well, I think the major factor is that we have this peephole that's of this success. So this is strong schools and that companies actually use very good in order to deliver great results over the world, working with Fortune 500 companies, and there are thousands of companies, and 300,000 people were involved in the IT sector before the war. And what they actually did in times of war is pretty much remarkable and incredible. The recent shows that the only industry that grew in times of war is IT, and it's 7% growth year over year. So they were resilient enough, and they did everything to go on with their operations, to remain active, to fulfill their obligations for the clients, and made $7.5 billion in revenues for Ukraine.
You have a microphone to help out. You're cutting in and out, so that's helpful. Let me ask you, it's such an important thing in terms of investment, and that's what businesses look for, about regulations. Give a sense about the regulatory reforms that Ukraine is implementing to enhance investment in Ukraine, not only now, but after this war concludes.
I can do two. Anyway, so when 3 years ago we started the Ministry of Digital Transformation, regulatory reform was on one of the top items on our list, and we've actually introduced it 2 weeks before the war. And it's called DSCD, which is a sort of a special economic zone, specifically designed for IT business, for startups, for venture capital firms. And the major benefit that the company was getting is, I think, the lowest taxes in the whole Europe region, because we understand that major expenditures for IT companies, the salaries. So we cut labor taxes like 5 times. And so far, we have 500 companies join this. I would call this virtual economic zone because we don't have a place. So it's not some specific territory where you can go and open an office. You can be everywhere in Ukraine. You just have to apply online. And once you're in register of companies in residents of DSCD, you are subject to receive those tax benefits. But not only tax benefits. We also introduced a number of things that never existed in Ukrainian legislation before in order to speak same language with the Silicon Valley investors and investors from around the world. Like in Ukraine, there was never before convertible notes. So we introduced convertible notes because that's the common instrument and common tool for investing in early stage startups. There was no liquidation preferences and many other things that American investors get used to. So we wanted to make Ukraine a destination where any US, Canada, or European investor come and he hears familiar things. He basically, the playbook which he used to invest is the same as in the United States as in Ukraine.
Rita Jo Lewis, let me talk to you. The Export-Import Bank plays such an important role in facilitating the movement of capital into important places like Ukraine. Last August, the bank signed a $3 billion memorandum of understanding with Ukraine. How is this financing facilitating and accelerating capital that's needed to bring these projects to life?
Well, first of all, John, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be here to talk with the private sector and so many different leaders from government as well as from our nonprofit sector. One of the things that is very clear for us is that we are the only official export credit agency of the United States. And for those of you who have been so graciously supporting XM, you know it's all about our mission of supporting U.S. jobs by facilitating exports. One of the things that became very, very clear when I joined XM over a year ago is that we had already signed an MOU prior to the start of the war because with Ukraine, and the value of that MOU was $3 billion. And the sectors that we were looking at were in the traditional ones that we have been working with Ukraine for over since 1990. Exim Bank is this year 89 years old. So we have a long-term relationship with the country. And so it became very clear to us when this unjust war broke out, that Exim Bank wanted to use all of any financing tools that we had, such as our loans, our guarantees, and our insurance, to be in support when the time is right for the support of rebuilding and reconstruction of Ukraine. So when we have also the MOU and the continued support that we have been providing every Ukraine leader that has traveled almost to the United States and around the world when we have been meeting with our other ECA partners, we have, as XM, US XM, we believe that the MOU sends the right signal, and the signal is to the private sector, to let them know that this is not going to be one agency or one government or one private sector company that has the ability to help in these efforts. That when you look at XM Bank, and you look at what we are able to provide, we know that it is going to be the combination of private capital. It is going to be the fact that XM, as all of you know, is there to help level the playing field for our American companies. We want to be able to make sure that our American companies who are looking at providing goods and services are able to compete globally, but also to be able to win. And so this MOU, we believe, is a strong manifestation of what the Biden-Harris administration, as the whole of government, that I'm sure you heard so many of our colleagues, my colleagues talk earlier today, that we know that it is the combination of all of us with the Advocacy Center and with the Department of Commerce, with DFC and our development organization, and so many others joining together with all of you in order to do the work that's going to be needed so our companies can compete, but also to win in this market.
Are there any particular sectors that you focus on as it relates to investment?
You know, first of all, from an overall XM perspective, our congressional mandate does not allow us to discriminate against any size or any sector. And one of the things, or any industry, and one of the things that we have been showing over this last term is how we are the bank for everyone. And being the bank for everyone, we understand that we have to diversify our portfolio. XM traditionally has been an agency where people may think, one, they either don't know about this little known agency that has 400 employees and an authorization through 2026 of over $135 billion, 100 of which we still have that we want to be able to deploy. But in the fact from a sector perspective, as it's particularly to Ukraine, we look at this topic that we're talking about, digital connectivity. And that's why we will, I'm sure, get into the question around transformational exports is an area, renewables is an area that we're going to be looking at. But the most important need that's going to be really a bit around what President Biden has joined with his G7 colleagues around the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And that's why the infrastructure needs we know are going to be great. XM has exceptional expertise and experience in large rail, roads, bridge types of projects, as well as digital connectivity efforts. And we want to see some of those projects, we believe, those very good projects, those bankable projects that are creating jobs, not just in the United States, but also in Ukraine, are going to be some areas that I know we're going to be able to focus on.
Well, each of the companies on this panel have worked alongside the Ukrainian government and other private and public organizations to support the people of Ukraine through technology and also providing various critical services. Max, let's talk about your company, AWS. How has AWS supported Ukraine during the course of this war?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's good to be here with all of these folks on the panel. I think I'd like to double down on something that the minister just said a second ago. He said one of our key resources is people. And that's one of the places that AWS leaned in with our partners in Ukraine. As the war broke out, we worked with one of their largest educational institutions, Optima Schools. And we took Optima Schools online on the cloud, initially with 9,000 students, growing within 1 month to over 80,000 students. And so we clearly saw the opportunity in the moment of crisis, but also as you look at rebuilding, to figure out how do you actually skill a population for the new digital world in a fast and efficient way. And so that was a great partnership. And we continue to ask ourselves that question. In fact, in October, we launched a program called IT Skills for You. And we collaborated again with companies and government institutions across the board. We've actually got 30 different organizations signed up now that are offering jobs, apprenticeships, and further training to the population in Ukraine still or displaced. And so, yeah, +1 on the people side of thing, and we need to keep investing in there. That's where it'll grow. The other interesting comment was had to do with what policy changes did you make? And I believe in addition to the ones that you talked about, when Minister Fedorov was with us at our conference in November, he talked about a critical government policy reform where they changed a policy that required government data to be in Ukraine. And instead they recognized, hey, it needs to be secure, but it doesn't necessarily be located there. And that actually was one of the major changes that opened up the ability to support Ukraine's government, education, and private sector digital transformation. So literally, as the war started, AWS was able to step in. We worked with 40 different government education institutions, bringing over 10 petabytes of data to the cloud, land registries, tax registries, education records, as well as commercial organizations like Privat Bank, in order to provide the resilience and the continuity of service that was going to be necessary. For instance, over 40% of Ukrainians use Privat Bank, and by making it available, resilient, and secure on the cloud, you continued to underpin that entire personal finance component.
Julia Boardman, you represent Google. When I think of Google, I think of search. And when I think of war, I think of weapons. And we don't necessarily put the two together. But in modern day warfare, disinformation is one of those factors that Ukraine is also fighting against. So give us a sense about how Google is fighting against disinformation, not only in Ukraine, but also in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, From the very beginning of the war, we understood we had a serious responsibility on the disinformation front, and we saw the pressure rising in Europe from the United States and elsewhere, and so we took action even before the sanctions came in to take down certain Russian news outlets and others that were on some of our platforms. When it comes to the cyber situation in general, if you go back to February of last year, there were many commentators in Washington who thought that the offensive Russian cyber capabilities would be stronger than the Ukrainian defensive ones, and that actually hasn't borne out in the way in which people anticipated. Google just released a really interesting report on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference just 2 months ago called Fog of War, and for those interested in this subject, I encourage you to take a look. It shows how not only did offensive Russian cyber capabilities attack Ukraine, they were also really targeting NATO countries, and they were not as successful as some might have anticipated. I think what you've seen emerge is a sort of digital NATO. Ukrainian government has been so effective in partnering with the United States, with European allies, and with US technology companies that Ukraine has been able to get the best tech cyber defense capabilities by including migrating to the cloud, both before the war and during the war. One small anecdote to share is at the very start of the war, we saw Ukrainian civil servants whose email accounts were under attack by the Russians, moving their work email, their government-issued email accounts stopped working. We saw many of them migrating to their personal Gmail accounts. So we quickly worked with the Ukrainian government to provide 50,000 licenses to our Google Enterprise Workspace accounts. So all of them are now working in a fully secure Google provided enterprise software on the cloud, which cannot be taken down in the same way in which the on-prem in-country information had been. So huge kudos to the Ukrainian government on what you've done, and we've been honored to partner with you.
Matt Devlin, Uber has really stepped up. And in fact, you're traveling back to Ukraine. I believe you told me it's next week, is that right? Third trip to Ukraine in the span of a year. Give me a sense and talk a little bit about how Uber has expanded its services across Ukraine since the start of the war.
Sure. So when the full-scale invasion happened, we were operating in 9 cities across Ukraine at that point in time. Since then, we've actually expanded to 18 cities all across the country. So we've actually doubled our footprint in Ukraine, invested heavily to do that during and despite the war. Because what that's mean is we're able to provide our riders with essential transportation despite the disruption of the war. And also, and very importantly, more than 25,000 drivers have been able to maintain a source of earning income for their families during the simultaneous economic challenges that Ukraine is facing. And so if you think of that as kind of the expansion of our core operations as the foundation of what we're doing in Ukraine, we've then layered on top of that several discrete relief initiatives. So we do free rides for displaced families, moving them to safety, for doctors, moving them to hospitals, teachers getting to schools. We have built customized logistics software for relief agencies in Ukraine, delivered more than 500 truckloads of emergency supplies. So initially, this was a lot of emergency food relief. More recently, it's been a lot of winter shelter supplies, so things like tarps for blown out windows, blankets, stoves, and more actually permanent reconstruction materials. And then also, as we push those supplies out into some of the frontline communities, we've also evacuated from those frontline areas a lot of irreplaceable pieces of Ukrainian cultural heritage. So artworks, historical archives, religious icons from over 250 sites where they're under continuing threat of Russian attack. And so that's really been the focus of our work inside Ukraine to date. We've also leveraged our platform outside of Ukraine. So in partnership with the Ministry of Digital Transformation and United 24, which is President Zelensky's fundraising platform, we actually have a feature in the Uber app that's allowed people across Europe, the US, and Canada to donate directly. And we've already sent more than 50 ambulances to Ukraine, and that number continues to tick up. And so that's where we are today. I'd say all those efforts have always been in response to the needs that our partners in Ukraine articulate. And so as those needs change, what we do will change to match that.
And food and supplies, that's so important for the people of Ukraine dealing with daily life in a war zone. That's where Uber also can play a big part.
Yeah, we've had to do a lot just to keep operating through this war. I mean, I think we're somewhat distinct in that we're certainly a technology company, but we're also certainly inextricably linked to the real and physical world. I mean, we move data across networks, but at the end of the day, we ultimately move people through cities. And in Ukraine, for the past 14 months, there's been cities that have been repeatedly and horrifically attacked. And so it's tremendously challenging to do that reliably and safely. And so we have to do things like establish and constantly update geofences, so we keep trips away from sensitive areas, and we only expand into new areas when they've been safely demined or de-risked. We have to respond in real time to airstrikes, so reroute trips around the impact, immediately identify if any drivers or riders who could have been injured by the impact and reach out to them, give them any help they need, and simply managing things like cell phone networks going down, how we continue to work through that. And I'd just say it's been an incredible challenge, but we have an even more incredibly talented team on the ground. And so I think I'm going to be the +2 or +3 to this point that you've probably heard throughout the day, that the Ukrainian tech community is incredibly dynamic, incredibly entrepreneurial, incredibly driven. And I'm just very, very proud that my colleagues and friends in our office in Kyiv are among the very, very best. So I think if there's one generalizable takeaway, it's that if you have to do something you're not sure you're able doing, and you have to do it in an environment in which you're not sure it's possible to do, I would go hire Ukrainians.
Rita, we have Uber, we have Google, we have AWS, 3 extremely well-known companies to the general public. For a company that's medium-sized or even a small business, how do they help out? How can they use your offices to help out the people that need this help in Ukraine?
You know, that is a question that we are constantly out talking with so many of you. What most people don't really understand about XM is that over 90% of our transactions last year, I think it was like 88.5% of our transactions went to small business. Our authorization was about 1.6 billion last year in the small business realm. XM has about 90 people of the 400 that focus on small business. So what we like to say, and which is true, no deal, no transaction is too small or too large for XM. We have the ability to work with small businesses, especially in this digital area, especially in the 5G space, because we know that that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. And also that's the companies that are creating the jobs. And so we have the ability to look at our working capital, our guarantees, our loans also applies to small business. We understand in all of the meetings that we have had with Ukraine officials is that small business is driving not only our economy here in the US, but also the economy in Ukraine. And so we stand ready to have our counselors and advisors available to assist our companies here in the United States, especially those who work with the large companies that are in the supply chain. You know, I have here today with me our Chief Banking Officer. I have our Office of Board Authorized Financing, who is our Senior Vice President, who's been running the point a lot on this Ukraine, as well as our external affairs. And one of the things, please raise your hand so they can know who you are, so they can target you when we leave. But the most important thing that we understand is that people are trying to have an ability to know how to work with XM Bank. And that is why we are open for business. We are available to you to help you understand how in the sectors that are going to be so sorely needed that we can assist you in your financing to participate in the rebuilding of Ukraine. And so when I look at the companies here, very large companies, they have very strong supply chains. We really want to be out there talking to not just the companies on this stage, but to any of our exporters out there who have the ability to have individuals who will need XM financing. Because to go into markets, which we all know, we have to, loan to underwrite to our risk, it is all about the business of this is an institution, XM Bank, that we stand back with the full faith and credit of the United States. So we do look for bankable deals. We're looking for applications. And remember, in our authorization, it definitely says to us, we have to ensure that any transaction, we get a reasonable rate, a reasonable assurance of repayment. You know, with the U.S. government, we want to get our money back. no one wants to owe us.
Max, I'm going to ask this question to you, but I also want an answer to this question from Ilya and Matt, and that is, how do you stay operational in the course of a war going on? We see here in the United States images of this war every day, and yet your company is operational. You're providing the necessary services to the people and businesses in some cases that need it. How do you do that?
Well, I'm going to steal a line from Minister Fedorov, and I'm going to start with "Be like Ukraine." They were fast and innovative. Literally, it was 5 days from the time we worked with the ministry to get in, provide them these high-capacity cloud storage edge devices called snowballs, got the information on there, and got it out and on the cloud. And people find reasons a lot of times for why they can't be fast or innovative. Now, a crisis, drives that, but it doesn't take a crisis. And so I would say, first of all, be like Ukraine. One of the things that we took away from it was we need to make it easier for governments and businesses to think about resilience. And so we created an offering called Continuity of Government IT, which helps governments around the world. A war is an extreme circumstance, but there's a lot of other reasons why you have interruptions in operational capability. And so resilience is a critical thing to think about. Several speakers have talked about, the emergency scenarios that they deal with. The cloud allows you in a way that legacy IT can't, to both drive innovation, to develop resilient, scalable IT capabilities, and third, to ensure security. And those three things, I think, are the key, certainly the areas that we focus on for private sector and public sector customers when we think about how do we help them make sure that they're on all the time.
Ilya?
I mean, certainly there are teams outside of Ukraine who've been supporting the folks in Ukraine, security teams, management teams, HR teams, et cetera. But the real heroes of this war and the real heroes that all of us at Google look up to are the people actually working day in, day out in Ukraine under extraordinary conditions. And so they're the ones inspiring us, and they're the ones who deserve all the praise.
Matt?
I think I'm just going to follow on that one. I mean, Ilya put it perfectly. We have teams around the world, pretty much in every time zone, dedicated to supporting our colleagues on the ground in Ukraine, and they do tremendous work, of which we're very proud. But at the end of the day, there is not a single product, tool, or solution we had in a box or on a shelf that we could take off and deploy in a war zone. That just wasn't what we had. We had to deploy it. It had to be fixed. It had to be tweaked. It had to be broken down. It had to be rebuilt. And the people who did that were the people on the ground.
Alex, I'm going to come back to you. These are very prominent companies that we have here on stage that are helping out your country in a very tangible way. Are companies coming to you? Or do you have to make a sales pitch to companies to help out during this war?
But sometimes yes, but in most cases, they come into us and asking like, what can we do? And I think I want to thank everyone on this panel and every company that supporting us. And I think they've been a little bit humble because what we calculated so far is $12 million that in cloud support, in accounts that you mentioned, in support of our startups, and supporting United 24, as Zuber mentioned, and we know everyone and communicating every day, almost everyday basis, and usually that's the initiative of those companies. We just highlight what we need. I think we had this big Lugano conference with the Initiative Digital for Freedom, where we, at some point, we decided to show what kind of areas where we need help. So each company could pick their own path and support in let's say education or support reconstruction or support digital governance. And we're trying to do this trying to come up with a systematic approach. So we not lose anyone and deliver help what it's needed. But generally, like this, I think those are $100 million already been delivered by tech giants and different kind of companies. And what is interesting for me is, in the beginning we were worried that since we have strong software outsourcing industry, that companies from United States, which actually they like 60% of all clients of Ukrainian IT will start telling them like, no, we don't want to work with you. But in the course of next month, we realized that's quite opposite. They insisted that we want to use and we want to work with Ukrainian developers because this way we want to support Ukraine. It's not a donation, but it's also very significant. I always tell this, the best way to help Ukraine is to invest in Ukraine. And working with Ukrainian entrepreneurs, investing in Ukrainian startups, working with Ukrainian IT companies and other companies, that's the contribution that we really need. And we're really grateful for that. And that's how I think this 7% growth was achieved, because people realize that Ukrainian companies need that. They need those contracts, they need that, those jobs and contractors, and being contractors, they have gotten this.
This may seem like an obvious answer to this question, but I have to ask it, and the question is why? Why step up? Why help out Ukraine? In some cases, you might be losing money in terms of your investment. What's the answer to that? And what do you say to other companies that perhaps would like to help out, that may realize that there may be a loss initially in terms of their investment in Ukraine? Max, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks. For me, as the leader of our worldwide public sector business, our reasons are simple. We have 3 tenets that guide the way that we do business. And the first one is customers' national priorities are our priorities. And this is a clear national priority. The second one is we look for customers who are simply dissatisfied with the status quo and believe they can do better. And so we love working with colleagues like those in Ukraine, with Minister Fedorov, who had this digital vision to be the world's most convenient country. And he had a small, scrappy group of people that embraced the cloud and that developed these applications like DIA, from scratch to the place where they're now deployed, across Ukraine with better than half the population online and digital, right, in a really compact period of time. And the third reason is that from day one, we've always said it's important for us to strive to make the world a better and a safer place. And frankly, all of those ingredients came together, and when the war started, Amazonians just leapt at all those different opportunities because it was just aligned with the way that we think about long-term customer value.
Ilya, let me ask you that same question. Why is Google stepping up? What does Google get out of this?
Well, I think the first thing to say is I don't think this was a very difficult decision for our executive management team to make, given the circumstances in February of last year. And then the second thing I would say is, and this has been said in these 4 walls many times today, which is just the extraordinary vibrancy and talent of the Ukraine tech sector. One number that sticks out in my head and just boggles the mind for me is that the revenue of Ukrainian startups last year exceeded $6 billion, which was 500 million more than the previous year. That's incredible when you consider the circumstances under which they've been operating, and that Ukrainian startups today are worth 3 times more than 2020. Yeah, I think the case is sort of made for itself then.
How about you, Matt?
I think I'd echo much of what's been said, but I'd go back to, again, the slight distinction with us is that we are so embedded in the cities in which we operate. in a way that's somewhat unique for a tech company. And so we have employees on the ground. We have tens of thousands of drivers on the ground living through this war, trying to support their families by earning, trying to support their communities by driving doctors to hospitals, teachers to schools. It was, as Ilya said, it's not even a close call for us what was the right thing to do in this.
As I mentioned at the top, I cover the White House. I cover everything associated with President Biden. He's spoken of the idea that the U.S. will support Ukraine for however long it takes. Let me bring it down to the level of what you're doing. How long are you committed, each of your companies, to the things that you've done over the course of this war since it began on February the 24th of last year? I'll start with you, Matt.
For as long as it takes. As long as there's a war in Ukraine, we will be providing a wartime relief. Whether it looks like what we're doing now, or if Ukrainian needs evolve, we'll evolve to meet those needs. As Ukraine has regained control of territory, we've expanded into cities that come under the control of the Ukrainian government again. We will continue to do that. And over the longer term, I think the North Star for our efforts is we want to play our part in ensuring that Ukraine's cities are economically dynamic, culturally vibrant, and socially connected within themselves and also to the rest of the world. We know there are millions of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine right now as refugees. They want to come home. Ukraine needs them to come home. And so we want to play our part making sure that Ukraine cities attract them and welcome them back, as well as international business people and visitors.
Will you talk about Google's plans going forward as it relates to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, earlier I was speaking about the really dynamic startup sector. Google recently announced a Google startup supporting Ukrainian startups. We just pulled together 58 of the startups that we started supporting from last year in Warsaw just last week to talk to them about how they're doing, to mentor them, et cetera. And it's amazing. On average, their revenues are up 106%. They're employing 800 people. They're really thriving. Yet, they're also facing really significant challenges. I think the latest statistics I've seen is 90% of Ukrainian startups are looking for additional funding. And so at Google, we're committed to supporting these and other startups and talking to VCs and things like that.
And AWS, talk a little bit about that, Max, going forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to, number one, continue to support Ukraine while the war from Russia is still in full swing. I think it's equally important to lay the foundation for rebuilding. And that's the second thing that we're also focused on, is helping lay the foundation for rebuilding. And that includes both rebuilding the institutions, but doing it in a way that is secure, resilient, and agile. It includes laying the foundations, as others have said, for small business success. And AWS makes programs available that allow startups to get access to free technical skills, free cloud credits, all to start that journey of digital innovation for themselves. And the third thing that I think is super important is the private sector. And being able to support the private sector as they rebuild is something that is core to AWS's business around the world. Startups, enterprises, public sector, all of them are going to be key to the rebuilding effort in Ukraine.
Rita, I'm going to end our session with you. As we all know, it's a divided Congress right now. Republicans control the House, Democrats control the Senate. Different dynamic in terms of moving forward in terms of aid for Ukraine. Talk a little bit about that challenge right now and what that means for you right now and what you expect in this divided Congress. Do you expect Congress to have that same bipartisan support for Ukraine, even with one party controlling each house of Congress?
I know that my colleagues from Commerce, the Secretary, and from State Department, and also from the White House was here and spoke, I'm sure, very eloquently around the President's commitment. One of the things we know at Ex-Im Bank is that we have had strong bipartisan support when we were reauthorized in 2019. All of the nominees who were nominated by the President in this term were confirmed by strong bipartisan support. And we have to operate in a bipartisan nature. It does not matter where or what state someone comes from. We are there to help our American exporters. And so we think we're very clear in our commitment. We have worked very strongly with the sovereign right now, and we will continue to do that. Exim Bank has a history because what people may have forgotten is that we were the implementers of the Marshall Plan. And that's one of the reasons why when in the work that we have done throughout last year and this year, talking to our lenders, talking to our brokers, talking to the banks, talking to CEOs, talking to small business, we feel that there is great opportunity there. And in that opportunity, we want to say we want to work very collaboratively with the private sector, and it is going to be very important as we go forward, and we look forward to working with every member of Congress in this effort.
Well, that's a great way to end it. I want to thank each of our panelists. Thank you for all you're doing, by the way. And thank you for continuing to do that. Thank you.